The Vikings have been slandered as violent barbarians who terrorized Europe for centuries, as subhuman animals sent by the devil, possessing no redeeming qualities, as soulless monsters incapable of intelligent thought, and astonishingly ugly to look at. To all this I say, malarkey. Only the Gingers are soulless, and they are hardly confined to Scandinavia. The Vikings did nothing wrong. The Vikings were avid explorers and expert sailors. They traveled the rivers and shores of Europe, making friends and sharing stories. Their longships opened new trade routes, allowing economies to flourish. Without the Vikings, Europe would have been a much drearier and poorer place. Impressed by the industriousness of the Vikings, other Europeans, mainly the French and British, sought to employ them in their own domestic industries. At first, Vikings were recruited in their areas of expertise, such as shipbuilding and making metal music, but recruitment soon expanded to other industries, specifically office work. You might think the outdoorsy, free-spirited Vikings would resent the indoor, sedentary pencil-pushing, but they were enticed by the reward structure. Gold stars, email commendations, pizza parties. What's not to like? The domestic workers were completely outclassed. They couldn't compete in productivity, innovation, cubicle decoration, or any other measurable metric. By the rules of office politics, they should have hated the Vikings. But they didn't. Not only had the Vikings built up years of goodwill as traders and storytellers, but they were excellent co-workers. They were never noisy or distracting. They volunteered for the worst jobs and were always willing to help. They invented communal candy bowls and regularly brought in baking. Above all, they never talked about their personal lives. Yes, it seemed impossible to hate the Vikings. Until it wasn't. The troubles began at lunchtime. Originally, the Vikings all went home for lunch to catch up with their favorite Thor and Odin cartoons. Then, a new management style swept across Europe, reducing lunches to half an hour and forcing all employees to eat together. They called it team building. The first few moments, as social hierarchies dictated who sat where in the cafeteria, were painfully awkward, but another crisis intervened. A whiff. A pungent aroma, the overwhelming urge to puke. The domestic workers panicked, convinced a bloated, tumorous rodent was loose, sick with the next plague. The Vikings smelled only happiness and were eager to eat. All eyes turned to the identical Viking lunches. It's not a diseased rat, the Vikings explained. It's surströmming. Surprisingly, the description of fermented fish did little to diffuse the situation. None of our other food comes in convenient cans with easy-to-open pull tabs. We'll starve. The Vikings were heartbroken, but open to suggestions. The domestic workers were past negotiating. The odor had driven them mad. Poop eater, turd breath. The Vikings couldn't believe it. It's just fermented fish. Naturally, management was insulated from the conflict as they ate in separate lunchrooms. The domestic workers clamored for Viking deportation. The Vikings, now enamored with office work, refused to back down. They loaded up the microwaves with fermented fish and maxed every setting. The bodies of the domestic workers were too many to count. The survivors stuffed good local wildflowers up their noses. Either by sneeze, bees, or allergies, they earned a reprieve. Management was stricken. The deaths were inconsequential, but the tit-for-tat exchanges were a clear drag on productivity. Since profit was the only relevant statistic, they scooped away the bodies and hired more Vikings. The Viking population swelled, and soon even wildflowers were powerless. A fishy smog wafted out of the offices and into the streets. Domestic workers retreated to the suburbs, but as more Vikings immigrated, even the suburbs became unsafe. Construction workers, cart drivers, unemployed artists. It was an assault on all domestic Europeans, except the managers and owners, as they lived on secluded private estates or in gaudy castles up on the high ground. They mostly read the email complaints and were annoyed at having to hire extra Viking gravediggers, but the bottom line was trending back in the right direction, so they patted themselves on the back and increased their own bonuses. More Vikings meant more surströmming, causing more deaths, creating more job openings. The cycle repeated, and the bodies piled up. As staunch environmentalists, the Vikings hated to let anything go to waste and selflessly rehabilitated the lands and possessions of the dead. The animals rejoiced, and the landfills were saved. When the gold and whatnot became too much for them to rehabilitate, they sent it home to Scandinavia, sacrificing precious cargo space on their ships. As time went on, these Vikings began to have children. Like any good second generation, they wanted nothing to do with their embarrassing heritage and to assimilate as quickly as possible. Their Scandinavian language, religion, and culture were tossed to the wayside. At the top of the list was surströmming. Of course, when the third generation came along, ancestry suddenly became important again, and there was a surströmming resurgence. But enough generations later, and it more or less died out completely. Other Europeans returned to Viking-occupied lands, and the populations blended until they became what we know today. Surströmming still exists, but it is safely locked away in Scandinavia by strict health and safety regulations. Every now and then, it claims another victim, but the deaths are entirely self-inflicted by idiots trying to go viral on the internet, so nothing of value is lost. We should, however, take a moment of silence for the true victims of the conflict, the lost profits from workers selfishly dying and abandoning their duties. Numbers are gone forever, but people can be replaced. Clearly, the Vikings are innocent. They only wanted to work and be productive. Their actions were purely defensive, and their plunder nothing more than abandoned waste diverted from landfills. Apologies are long overdue to our Scandinavian friends. There are plenty of legitimate reasons to laugh at them, like their high standard of living and boring flags, but their heritage is not one of them. Perhaps we should give the French and British, the so-called largest victims of the Vikings, a break too. After all, they wouldn't know anything about what real colonialism looks like.